The air inside the Vatican audience chamber felt almost sacred, the golden light from the stained glass spilling across the marble floor. Every whisper, every footstep seemed to echo against the towering walls. Jonathan Roumie stepped forward, his hand outstretched in quiet respect. This was the moment he dreamed about, meeting the Pope himself. But instead of the warm handshake he expected, Pope Leo XIV looked down at Jonathan's hand, then locked eyes with him. In a voice barely above a whisper, he said two words that froze the room: "Not yet." A ripple of shock moved through the chamber. Cameras clicked, guests exchanged uneasy glances. What had just happened? Why would the Pope refuse to shake hands with the man who played Jesus in front of millions? No one knew it yet, but those two words were the start of something that had been building for 43 years. Somewhere deep inside the Vatican, hidden in its archives, there was an old photograph. For decades, it had gathered dust, its story untold. That single image held the key to a promise made to a dying man, a promise that would reach across generations to this very moment. That man was Jonathan's grandfather. And he had risked his life in the middle of a war, believing that one day, God would use his grandson in a way the world could never forget. Picture it for just a second: Lebanon, years ago. Smoke in the air. Gunfire in the distance. A young priest stepping forward, knowing it might cost him everything. A vision in his heart of a grandson he would never meet. If you're watching this, you're about to witness a moment so rare, so personal, that it's never been told before. And when you learn the truth, you'll never see Jonathan, or Pope Leo XIV, the same way again. Jonathan Roumie had lived many unforgettable moments since stepping into the role of Jesus in The Chosen, but nothing compared to the weight of the envelope that arrived at his modest home one afternoon. Heavy cream paper, golden seal, the Vatican's crest pressed deep into the fold. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. The letter described it as a sacred dialogue on faith and media, with Pope Leo XIV during the Feast of Divine Mercy. Most actors would think of the honor, the prestige. Jonathan thought of his grandmother. He could almost hear her voice telling him, as she had so many times, that God would one day use him in ways far beyond his imagination. The words rang louder now than ever before. What Jonathan didn't know was that, weeks earlier, the Pope himself had been preparing for this very moment in complete secrecy. While the Vatican staff handled formalities and security, Pope Leo XIV sat alone in his private quarters for hours, hands wrapped around a faded black and white photograph. It showed a young Lebanese priest, his eyes steady and kind, Jonathan's grandfather. The Pope had carried that photograph for decades, waiting for the day when the man in the picture's grandson would stand before him. He had made a vow to that priest in the middle of a war, and he would not break it. But the moment to speak the truth had to be perfect. When Jonathan arrived in Rome, he joined a small group of invited guests: a Christian musician, a documentary filmmaker, a best-selling author of faith books. They moved past the Swiss guards in bright uniforms, through corridors that had seen centuries of history. Jonathan barely heard the chatter of the others. He reached into his pocket and gripped his grandmother's old wooden rosary. It was a habit whenever something important was about to happen, but this time, it wasn't just nerves. Something deeper pressed on his heart. Inside the audience chamber, silence fell like a blanket. Pope Leo XIV sat in a simple wooden chair, head bowed in prayer, rosary in his hands. One by one, each guest stepped forward, offered a handshake, exchanged a few words. The Pope smiled warmly at them all. Then Jonathan's name was announced. He stepped forward, extended his hand in quiet respect, and the room shifted. The Pope's expression changed, warmth giving way to something sharper, almost personal. His eyes searched Jonathan's face, and then came the words that would make headlines around the world: "Not yet." The silence that followed was suffocating. Cameras clicked. A few guests shifted awkwardly in their seats. Jonathan froze, his hand still hanging between them. Confusion burned in his mind. Had he done something wrong? Was this a breach of protocol? But in the Pope's eyes, there was no anger. There was recognition, the kind you feel when you're looking at a ghost from your past. The Pope slowly rose from his chair, closing the small gap between them. In a voice too low for anyone else to hear, he said, "I knew your grandfather, and I made him a promise." Jonathan's breath caught. His grandfather had died when Jonathan was a baby. All he knew was that the man had been a priest in Lebanon during the Civil War and that his grandmother almost never spoke about those years. In that moment, Jonathan understood this was no ordinary meeting. This wasn't about an actor meeting a religious leader. It wasn't about The Chosen or faith and media. This was about something far older, far deeper, a story that began long before Jonathan was born. The handshake wasn't refused as a slight. It was held back because the moment had to carry the full weight of a promise made in blood, faith, and sacrifice. Something told him his life was about to change forever. Pope Leo XIV reached into the folds of his robes and pulled out something worn with time. The edges frayed, the paper softened from years of being held. He handed it to Jonathan without a word. It was a black and white photograph. On the left stood a young Lebanese priest with strong, kind eyes. On the right, a young man in seminary robes who Jonathan instantly recognized from history books, the future pope himself. Your grandfather, Father Mikhail Roumie, the pope said quietly, and me 43 years ago in Beirut. The pope's voice softened as he told the story. The two had served side by side in a city under siege, with bombs shaking the ground and sniper fire cracking in the distance. Jonathan's grandfather had saved his life more than once, dragging him out of a collapsing building, shielding him from shrapnel, refusing to abandon him when others fled. We were brothers in the darkest days, the pope said, his eyes distant. Then came the part that made Jonathan's chest tighten. The pope told him about December 15, 1981, the day his grandfather died. For 3 days, the bombing hadn't stopped. Inside St. George Cathedral, 30 families huddled in the basement with no food, no water, and the sound of death outside. A sniper had a clear view of the only way out. The pope's voice trembled. Your grandfather looked at me and said, "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." He grabbed the church bell rope, ringing it so loud that the sniper turned his aim. Then, in full view, he ran into the open courtyard, praying the Our Father at the top of his voice. The bullets hit him, but he kept ringing the bell until the last family escaped. His final words were a prophecy, that his grandson would one day show Jesus to the world. The Pope then reached for a simple wooden cross, the grain worn smooth by decades of prayer. "This was his," he said. "I've carried it for 43 years, waiting for you." He placed it in Jonathan's hands. Jonathan could feel the weight, not just of wood, but of history, sacrifice, and calling. And then, to the shock of everyone in the room, the Pope sank to his knees before Jonathan. The leader of the Catholic Church looked up at the actor and said, "The handshake I refused you as an actor, I now ask from you as Christ's representative." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as the room fell into a holy silence. Witnesses stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. The Pope stood and took out a small gold ring engraved with the seal of St. George. "This was your grandfather's ordination ring. He told me to place it on your hand when your calling was revealed." Slowly, he slid it onto Jonathan's finger. "With this ring, you are commissioned to be Christ's voice to the voiceless." Finally, the Pope handed Jonathan a sealed envelope. Inside was a single handwritten page, dated the day before his grandfather died. The translation read, "To my grandson who will show Jesus to the world. Remember, you are not just acting like him, you are carrying him to those who need to see him. When the world feels heavy, remember the cross was heavy too, but love made it light." Jonathan's hands trembled as he read. Every word felt like it had traveled across decades just to land in his heart. In that moment he knew, this was no coincidence. This was the moment his entire life had been leading to. Jonathan stood silent for a long moment, the weight of the Pope's words and his grandfather's letter pressing on his heart. Finally, with a steady voice, he said, "I'll do it. I'll carry this mission forward. I'll speak for the Lebanese Christians who have no voice." But he added one request. Before stepping into the calling, he wanted to go to Lebanon, to stand at his grandfather's grave, and pray inside his private chapel. He needed to see where this story began before he could carry it forward. Pope Leo XIV nodded with understanding. From his desk, he retrieved a worn leather-bound journal and placed it in Jonathan's hands. "Your grandfather wrote in this every day during his final months. His prayers, his thoughts, his hopes for you, they're all in here." Then the Pope opened a small wooden box and pulled out a simple silver key. "This opens his chapel at the ruins of St. George Cathedral. When you're there, let him teach you what I cannot." The Pope placed his hands on Jonathan's shoulders and prayed, not just a blessing, but a passing of responsibility, as if a spiritual mantle was being laid on Jonathan's life. "Your grandfather's race is finished. Yours begins now. Go with God." When they opened their eyes, there was a quiet stillness in the room that no one wanted to break. As they walked together to the great doors of the Vatican, the Pope's shoulders seemed lighter, as if a 43-year promise had finally been fulfilled. He clasped Jonathan's hand one last time before letting him go. 6 months later, Jonathan stood in the rebuilt sanctuary of St. George Cathedral in Beirut. The cross that once hung around his grandfather's neck now rested on his own. The ordination ring gleamed on his hand. In front of him sat survivors of decades of persecution. He read aloud from the journal, his voice steady, carrying his grandfather's prayers back to the very people he had died protecting. Word began to spread through persecuted Christian communities around the world. Father Mikhail's grandson had taken up his mission. To them, Jonathan wasn't just the actor who played Jesus. He was living proof that God remembers promises, even across generations. His portrayal on screen took on a new depth, shaped by the real suffering and faith he now carried. Looking back on that first meeting with Pope Leo XIV, Jonathan understood the meaning of not yet. Some doors have to open at the exact moment they're meant to. Some rejections are really redirections towards something far greater. And now, speaking directly to you, maybe your own not yet is simply God's way of saying, wait for the right moment. Because when that moment comes, it might just change everything.